it can feel quite counterintuitive because parents feel they're hurting their child by giving this information. And I try to encourage people to remember that they aren't hurting their child. The situation is painful, the situation is difficult. So even very young children can sense the stress, discomfort, anxiety in their parents. And I think it's important to remember that when we are thinking about what we're saying to our children.
What language should not be used, or is there anything we should avoid saying?
Oh yeah, well I would encourage, I don't know about avoid, I really struggle with
Hello, I'm Hannah and welcome back to the Life and Loss podcast, where we discuss difficult topics including living with life-limiting illnesses, dying, death and bereavement. Today I'm joined by Leo, a social worker based at Forest Holme Hospice. Welcome Leo.
Hello.
And in this episode, we will discuss when and how to begin discussing a terminal diagnosis with a child. We'll also share some age-appropriate advice on language and communication strategies. So Leo, obviously this is a very emotive topic. A mother myself of 2 children. If someone listening has been diagnosed with a terminal condition, how would they start the conversation with their children? Well, I mean, I think it's different for everybody. There are some general kind of pieces of advice and information we would give, but I like to start by acknowledging that it is an emotive subject and it is a difficult thing to approach, and rightly so. And I don't tend to tell parents there's an exactly right way or a wrong way to have that conversation. I try and encourage families to think about what's helpful in the situation and what might be less helpful. And I try and talk to families and work out what they would find useful. But thinking about how they might approach the conversation or how they might start the conversation, my general quite broad advice is to try to be as open and as honest as they can be with, their knowledge of their children or the knowledge of the children they're talking to. Because all children are different, all families are different, so there isn't a precise way to do it. But the general principles of being open, being honest, being clear are the sort of starting points. It sounds very simple, but it's actually quite a complex thing to do. Talking about the emotions of it, I think is a really important place to start, because although it is such a significant conversation for children, sometimes what parents are worried about is how they protect their child. Yes.
How they keep their child safe. And being told they have a life-limiting illness is very undermining for a parent, because they are trying to work out, how do I keep my child safe? Can I protect them from this?
Yeah.
And what I try to do is help people move to a position where they can think, what does protecting my child look like in this situation? Mm-hmm. It may not be possible, if we're honest, in a lot of situations to keep our children from all harm. It's not possible. So we have to think about what protecting them looks like. And my advice is that in that situation, when someone's been told they have a life-limiting illness or a terminal illness, that actually being open and being honest is protective, because it allows your child to talk to you and to get support from you. If they're unable to ask you questions, if they're unable to seek your help and support because we're not having the conversation, they can feel left out, they can feel unprotected and unsupported. So it can feel quite counterintuitive because parents feel they're hurting their child by giving this information. And I try to encourage people to remember that they aren't hurting their child. The situation is painful, the situation is difficult. That's different to them causing harm or causing pain. Does that? That makes sense completely.
And I suppose they're going to find out eventually anyway, aren't they? You're just letting them know earlier on.
Yes, yeah, and there isn't an exactly right time for someone to have that conversation though. And I try very hard to remember that I don't know what it's like to be in that situation.
Yes.
And I don't pretend to know what those parents are experiencing. All I can do is give people advice based on what I know other families have found helpful in that situation. And I do that from a place of honesty,
yes.
And being clear that actually there isn't a right thing for every family. Mm-hmm. But having the conversation as early as parents feel able to, and that's different for everybody, is overall helpful. It might, in the first instance, feel like it's causing distress or causing pain, but ultimately, like you say, children have ears.
Yes.
They know things we don't think they know. They understand things we haven't thought they would understand, even very young children.
Yeah, they pick up on things very easily, don't they?
Yeah. If you think about a baby's hardwired to look at their caregiver, to look at someone's face and say, are you happy? Am I okay? Am I comfortable? Am I relaxed? If I'm anxious and I'm worried and I'm scared, a baby looking at me should pick that up.
Okay.
So even very young children can sense distress, discomfort, anxiety in their parents. And I think it's important to remember that when we are thinking about what we're saying to our children. Obviously, when we talk about children, we're talking about people under the age of 18. So that's a huge range of experiences and understanding. And you know, no two 16-year-olds are the same, no two 6-month-olds are exactly the same. You're going to need different things for different children. And I would trust parents to know their kids well enough to know what to say and when to say it. But I would suggest that having open, honest conversations lays the groundwork for taking care of your children, you know, for allowing them to ask questions and allowing them to seek your reassurance. If you try and think of it as a house that you're putting a fence around. So there's this big kind of concern or anxiety, and what I want to do is be defensive around that, put things up. I think it's important to remember that you need your children on this side of the fence, so you can look after them. I've never had a young person or a child say, I wish they hadn't told me, I wish people hadn't been honest, I wish people hadn't been clear. I have had the opposite.
Yes.
My feeling is that young people and children have enough to feel confused, angry, distressed, upset about, without thinking, why wasn't I told? Why wasn't I trusted? Why wasn't I given that information? In saying that, I'm really conscious that I don't want parents to feel they've done something wrong if they haven't had this conversation at that point, if they haven't prepared their child in this way or done this thing that, you know, I would advise or someone else like me would advise or a book would tell you or a website would tell you, because I think that can be a kind of a source of anxiety and guilt for parents, and I don't think that's helpful.
I suppose they're dealing with a lot already, aren't they? It's another area to deal with.
Absolutely, and it's understandable that, and it's really advisable that as adults we take a moment to think about difficult information and difficult situations before we talk to children. And it's okay for us to actually hold some of that and think about how we give that information to children in a kind of considered way. But those conversations aren't easy, and they're not supposed to be all right, and parents aren't supposed to get them right. You know, I think that's one of the worries for some parents, is to say, I'm worried about saying the wrong thing, which I think is natural, but then that can create saying nothing, which is also unhelpful. So there's a balance, you know, and I don't think there's an exact way, but the general principles are, let's be honest, let's be open, listen to each other, and then work out how to take care of each other. That would be my general advice.
And is there sort of a standard set of responses that a child might give, or how might they react to being given that news?
I don't think there's a normal reaction to being told that someone you love is seriously unwell and might die. I just don't think there's a normal reaction to that. There are lots of reactions that are ordinary, but I don't think there's a way that children react. So kids are kids, and they're surprising, and they're funny, and they're rude, and they're lovely, and they're everything in between. And I think that people's children will respond how their children respond. There's not an ideal way for them to take that news, or for them to say, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I love you. That isn't the ideal response. The ideal response might be, you can't leave me, that's terrible, how dare you? That might be the response. It might not be. It might be, okay, can I still go to the party at the weekend? You know, it might be, because they're kids, and they're allowed to have that response. And I would really encourage families or adults talking to kids who are receiving difficult news to remember that they're not supposed to respond in a certain way, and the children definitely aren't supposed to get it right. Parents aren't supposed to get it right, and it's not a conversation you have once and tick, we've done that. It's starting a conversation that's going to continue for a long time.
So I suppose if you get a response like that, yes, but can I go to a party? I suppose would they then maybe bring it up at another time, sort of at a bedtime or something, where the child's got a bit more time to talk? Yeah,
and the response might be, yes, of course you can go to the party. That's a good response to that question. And I think that, you know, as adults, we really need to try and meet kids where they are, not where we think they're going to be or expect them to be. Because if a child receiving that information is incredibly distressed, that's okay. And that's ordinary as well. We wouldn't expect them not to be distressed. If a parent telling a child that they have a life-limiting illness becomes upset and cries, that's okay. Yeah. Why shouldn't they?
Yeah.
I've known some young people to say, no one was upset, no one cried in front of me, that's weird, don't they care? So we don't know exactly how our conversations are going to be received. So I think it's best for parents to try to be themselves as close as they can be.
Yes.
Because that's what their kids need. They need their parents to be their parent. They don't need something extraordinary or special. They need their parents. And I think in that very difficult situation, like ordinary parenting, I think is exceptional.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? To be able to say, this is what's happening, this is where we're at, this is very difficult news, we'll tell you when things change, we'll keep you updated. And then to say, and you need to go to football practice later, or tomorrow, or do you want to go to nanny's at the weekend still? Or, okay, you've got a sleepover on Saturday, do you still want that to happen? I think that's extraordinary parenting.
Yes, definitely.
Because you're keeping your child at the forefront, you're being open, you're being honest, but you're also prioritising them.
Yeah,
and
you're
their
combining.
needs, and you're allowing them to be themselves. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of having those initial conversations, is it advisable that you have it sort of a one-on-one situation, or would you have someone else there with you to talk to your child?
Everyone's, I'm going to sound like a broken record. I'm going to say everyone's different, and that's really boring, but they are. I would suggest that if any of us, and I try and talk about, I know children aren't adults, but I try and talk about children and adults as people. And I would suggest that any of us receiving difficult news would prefer that to happen in an environment we feel comfortable in, and with people we trust.
Yes.
And that's going to be different for different kids. I would encourage parents to have that conversation themselves, or to be very present when that happens. And I don't know that it's particularly helpful to then have a child have to then go and talk to a parent after having had this information to go and check it. I have had kids say to other people that have delivered bad news, you're lying, that's not true.
Okay.
You're horrible, how
Yes.
dare you say that? Children don't tend to say that to their parents who are unwell or are telling them what's happening. They tend to be allowed to express their emotions differently.
Yeah.
So I would encourage people to think about who the best person to deliver that information is. And I would normally say it's the person who's unwell.
Yes.
We're talking a lot about parents, but actually it's really important to remember that parents aren't the only important adult to children.
Yeah, absolutely.
Grandparents, aunties, uncles, family, friends, parents' friends, best friends' parents, these are all important people, and it's really important to think about who gives children that information.
Absolutely.
I would generally say within a family, the person who's unwell is a good person to deliver that information. Okay. If it's a grandparent and they feel unable to, then maybe they're present when the parent does it, or maybe the parent has that conversation, then they talk to a grandparent later. But if it's a parent, I would say, they really, if they are able to, or they're able to be supported by people around them to have that conversation, they're the right people to do that.
Okay. I hope that you are finding this episode useful. Perhaps you have a question you'd like to ask. You can do this by commenting below. Your input shapes the conversations we have and the topics that we explore. So don't hesitate to reach out and let us know what you'd like to hear more of. And what sort of questions would a child ask?
So, anything, we've already said. Lots of practical concerns.
Yes.
Are we still going to be able to do this? Will you do this for me? What will happen if? I think some children will quite quickly say, are you going to die?
Yes.
And that's, I think, one of the very understandable reasons that parents put off, delay, don't want to have that conversation. And why would you want to have that conversation? And I think that's a question that parents do need to have some sort of response to. And the answer can be yes. I don't know when. And obviously a life-limiting illness, we're talking about huge different conditions. It could be, people could have a lot of different responses to that question. But I think to be as close to the truth as possible, or as bearable is what I would encourage parents to do. We sometimes talk about it like giving children pieces of information so they can build up a clear picture as they go along. They may not need all of the information on day one, but actually as things progress, that might be really helpful. And if a child asks, are you going to die? I think we have to have that conversation about, that I've been told I'm not going to recover from this illness. We don't know how long I have. That could be someone saying I've got weeks, that could be someone saying I've got months, that could be someone saying I've got years. But what is helpful is to say we don't know. But what I do know is that if that changes, if I'm told I have a short time to live, you'll be the first people that I tell.
Okay.
Because I think that the children I know who have had that conversation are then able to go out tomorrow to the club that's important, because they know that if something's going to happen tomorrow, they would have been told.
Yes.
So they can trust, as much as we know, none of us know where we're going to be tomorrow, but as much as possible, they can trust that their parents are going to tell them if something changes.
Okay.
Which is why I would suggest like that being open, being honest, being clear lays the foundation for other helpful conversations. It also allows kids to go out and be kids. So what some people are worried about is that piece of information is going to stop their child being able to function normally.
Yes.
And in my experience, it actually helps children function normally.
Okay, oh, that's interesting.
Because they're able to say, well, I am able to go to school today. I don't have to stare at home and look at mum in case something goes wrong. I can be apart from her. I can go and enjoy my things. And actually, she's giving me permission to be okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to take that opportunity. And she's going to tell me if something changes. So I think that the fears around those conversations being harmful and damaging are understandable, but there is an alternative,
yes,
which is that those conversations can be helpful and they can be supportive. We know that children who are prepared for a parent's death are better prepared for the grief that they're going to experience. And one of the things they will have in their favour is their family have started to develop the ability to talk about difficult things.
Yes.
And to be clear about feelings and to be clear about emotions and to work out how to take care of each other with that, or take care of themselves with that. So I would suggest that starting those conversations and being clear actually allows children to.
And then on the opposite end, what language should not be used, or is there anything we should avoid saying?
Oh yeah, well I would encourage, I don't know about avoid, I really struggle with being clear about what people shouldn't say, because it feels a bit judgmental and like there's a precise way to do it. I would encourage people to use clear language. My advice would be to name illnesses, to name conditions, to name what's happening. There's really good reasons for that. So if we think about children's understanding of illness, particularly little kids, older children do better, and teenagers definitely do better with euphemisms.
Yes.
Young children don't. They can be quite literal, particularly children under the age of like 5 can be very literal. So I think it's really important to think about the language you use, because if we're saying poorly, if we're saying not well, if we're saying daddy has a pain in his tummy, we don't name that, their daddy isn't going to be the only person they know that ever has a pain in their tummy.
Yes.
So it's really important to be clear about what the illness is. So I would suggest that if their dad has cancer that's in their stomach, they have that conversation and they try and explain what cancer is, particularly for young kids. Because if you're talking to a young child, we talk about illness being like, take that out of your mouth, don't touch that, stop licking your brother, you're going to catch his cold. That's how we talk about transmissible kind of illnesses a lot with children. And when we're talking about a disease like cancer or maybe like a heart condition, we're not necessarily talking about a transmissible illness. And it's really important that a little child will know that if you go and hug your dad, you're not going to catch this.
Yes,
it's okay. So we don't have to kind of we don't have to use language that we think is protective for children, because it might actually be confusing.
Yeah, so they don't think that the mum might get a stomach pain and then suddenly they're going to die as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think or they might have a stomach pain, they might think they're going to die as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to have to use clear language. There's other reasons for that as well, because if we can be clear that a parent has, I'll talk about cancer. I'm aware it's not the only life-limiting illness, but I'll use it as a useful example. If we are talking about cancer, it's really important that a child has an understanding of what that condition is, how it works, what the kind of treatments look like, what the consequences might be, what some of the side effects of that treatment might be, what some of the symptoms of the illness might be, because it may help their understanding of what is happening. For quite young kids, they can be quite... have you ever heard of a term called magical thinking?
No.
Okay, so it's a child developmental term that thinks about children having a belief that they can make something happen.
Okay.
So they can make something happen by thinking it, by trying hard.
Yes.
So if I shout at Dad and then he has a lot of pain and goes into hospital and then he becomes really unwell and then he dies, did Dad die because I shouted at him?
Oh.
So it's really important for them to understand the difference between those things. And that's why I would ask parents and families, if they're able to prepare children by using the scientific language, the words, the names for the illnesses, because it takes away the personal responsibility.
Yes.
It's not, children haven't done anything to make their parents ill. They need to know that. Yeah. I know it sounds like an obvious thing, but they need to hear it. It's nothing they did, nothing they said, nothing they thought. It's happening because these cells in their parents' body have started to behave in this way that we don't understand, and it's creating a thing called a tumour, and a tumour is a cancer. And that's stopping the body working normally, and that's why Dad is unwell, and that's why Dad's dying. And it's not you, it's that. And I think that's really important. And I'm talking about young children, but I don't think it's a different conversation with teenagers either. You just use different language. And I would trust families to know their kids well enough to know how to deliver that information. But the basic principles is be open, be honest, and use clear language.
And children are very complex, aren't they? Their emotions are so extreme, and I imagine there are times where teenagers think, oh, I wish that they weren't there or something. And if they think that there's an association, it must be an awful feeling for that child to live with. Yeah,
I think you're right. It's not strange for a teenager to think, oh gosh, I said this terrible thing to my parent. If we think about the things that teenagers say to each other, to parents, I think it wouldn't be odd for a teenager to say to a parent, I wish you were dead.
Yeah.
I wish I was dead.
Yeah.
So take out illness, that's not a strange or very unusual thing for a teenager to say. It might not be a great thing for a teenager to say, but it's also not sort of unheard of. So if we can be clear that they don't hold a personal responsibility for their parents' health or for keeping their parents safe, or, they can be useful, they can be supportive and helpful, that's lovely, but it's not their responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think that's why using kind of age appropriate but clear language matters.
Yeah, definitely. So if anyone listening to this podcast today wants some additional support or advice, where would you recommend that they go?
There's lots of good advice and information online. I think I would encourage people to look locally, but there's also really good national charities. I would, if you're thinking about talking about life-limiting illnesses, there are some very good national charities. There's Winston Swish, which is National Children's Bereavement Charity, but they have a lot of information about how to prepare children, what to say. And they've got some example sort of conversations and sentences you could use that are really helpful. There is Grief Encounters, which talks mostly about bereavement, but there's some things on there for young people and teenagers. I would encourage people to look at the Macmillan website, talking about how to have a conversation with children, specifically about cancer, but I think it spreads to, other conditions as well. I would encourage parents to look at information before they direct their kids towards it. But for parents, I would encourage them to look at things like Macmillan, like Winston Swish, if you're talking about how to prepare a child.
Okay. Thank you very much, Leo, for joining us. And thank you for listening to the Life and Loss podcast today. If you'd like more information about our charity, our website is www.forestholmehospice.org.uk. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode useful, click the subscribe button. Share this episode with a friend or a loved one. And don't forget to give us a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means so much.